The grill was still smoking when I heard the laughter, quiet at first, then sharper, crueler, like shards of glass scattered across the otherwise pleasant hum of a summer afternoon. My son, Ethan, stood frozen near the picnic table, a paper plate laden with a hot dog he hadn't touched clutched in his hand. His gaze was fixed on his older cousins, Mark and David, who had just contorted their faces in a grotesque imitation of his stutter for the third time that afternoon. Ethan's shoulders were hunched, his small frame looking even smaller against the backdrop of sprawling oak trees and the boisterous energy of our annual family barbecue. My breath caught. A familiar knot tightened in my stomach, a sickening blend of anger and helplessness. I told myself not to make a scene, not to be that mother, the one who couldn't take a joke, the one who amplified every minor slight. My husband, Tom, always said I was too sensitive about it, that Ethan needed to toughen up, that boys will be boys. His words, meant to reassure, always felt like tiny dismissals, leaving me alone on an island of fierce, unspoken protectiveness. I watched as my sister-in-law, Laura, Mark and David's mother, offered a brittle laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes, then turned back to her conversation about garden pests with Aunt Carol. My own brother, Mike, caught my eye for a fleeting second, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression before he looked away, busying himself with a can of soda. They heard it. They all heard it. And they chose the path of least resistance, the path that left Ethan standing alone. Ethan didn't cry. He rarely did, not in public. He just stood there, a small, silent statue, the colorful swirl of the potato salad on his plate a stark contrast to the pallor of his face. His knuckles were white where he gripped the flimsy paper plate. I saw the slight tremor in his lower lip, the way his gaze dropped to the trampled grass beneath his worn sneakers. Each beat of my heart was a painful thud against my ribs. This was the moment, the one I always dreaded, where the cheerful facade of family togetherness cracked to reveal the casual unkindness that lurked beneath. I started to push myself up from the rickety lawn chair, the metal groaning in protest. My voice was already forming in my throat, a carefully modulated rebuke I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind, one that wouldn't sound shrewish or overly dramatic, but firm. Protective. Just as I took my first step, a low rumble interrupted the scattered conversations and the sizzle of burgers on the grill. A black SUV, sleek and imposing, rolled slowly up the gravel driveway. It was out of place here, amidst our collection of dusty sedans and practical minivans. The tinted windows reflected the sun, making it impossible to see inside. Conversation dwindled. Heads turned. Even Mark and David paused their taunting, their attention caught by the unfamiliar vehicle. The crunch of tires on gravel seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. The SUV came to a smooth stop near the edge of the lawn. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a rear door opened with a soft, expensive-sounding click. What stepped out didn't just change the tone of the barbecue, it felt, in that instant, like it had the power to change the way everyone saw my son forever. My mind rewound, unbidden, to a cramped, overly warm room filled with brightly colored posters of smiling animals enunciating exaggerated vowel sounds. Ethan, then 6, sat on a child-sized chair, his small hands twisting in his lap. Mrs. Albright, the speech therapist, a kind woman with gentle eyes and an infinitely patient smile, held up a card. "R.R. Rabbit, Ethan. Can you try?" Take a deep breath. Ethan's face would flush a painful red. His mouth would open, a small, silent O, then clamp shut. Sometimes a choked sound would escape, a frustrated whimper that tore at my insides. I'd sit in the corner, pretending to read a magazine, but every strained muscle in his tiny body, every flicker of despair in his eyes, was a direct blow to my heart. The drives home were often silent, the weight of his unspoken struggle filling the car, heavier than any words. He'd stare out the window, his reflection a ghostly image against the passing trees, and I'd fight back my own tears, unsure if my comfort would soothe or suffocate. There were the nights, too. Long after Tom was asleep, I'd hear faint sounds from Ethan's room. I'd find him standing before his small dresser mirror, his reflection pale in the dim glow of his nightlight. "THTH the BBB Brown. Bear," he'd whisper, his voice cracking, his small fists clenched at his sides. He'd trace the words in a picture book, his finger trembling, as if the very act of touching them might imbue him with the ability to speak them fluently. Sometimes he'd see me in the doorway, and his face would crumple. He wouldn't run to me, but would turn back to the mirror, shoulders shaking, his quiet sobs a soundtrack to my own aching helplessness. I'd want to rush in, to hold him, to tell him it didn't matter, that his words were beautiful no matter how they came out, but I knew, deep down, that it mattered immensely to him. At family gatherings like this one, the casual dismissals were the hardest to bear. "He's just shy," Aunt Carol would say, patting my arm condescendingly. "He'll grow out of it." My David was a late talker. But Ethan wasn't just a late talker. His thoughts were quick, his understanding profound, but the words, they often got stuck, caught in a frustrating tangle between his brain and his tongue. "You coddle him, Sarah," my own mother had said once, her voice laced with that familiar tone of gentle disapproval. "If you don't make such a big deal out of it, neither will anyone else. He's too sensitive. Too sensitive." As if sensitivity were a flaw, a weakness to be stamped out, rather than a sign of his deep empathy, his keen observation of the world around him. I'd try to explain, to make them understand the daily courage it took for Ethan to simply speak, but my words would often get lost, dismissed as maternal overanxiousness. Tom, bless his heart, would try to mediate. "They don't mean any harm, Sarah. They love Ethan." But love, I was learning, didn't always equate to understanding or even kindness. Now, back on the sun-dappled lawn, the figure emerging from the SUV slowly came into focus. It was a man, tall and distinguished, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead. He wore a simple, well-cut linen shirt and dark trousers, an air of quiet authority about him. I didn't recognize him. No one seemed to. A murmur rippled through the assembled family. The man scanned the crowd, his expression calm, almost serene. His gaze passed over the adults, over the boisterous teenagers, and then it settled. It settled on Ethan. A slow smile spread across the man's face, a smile of genuine warmth and recognition. He moved with an unhurried grace, not towards me, or Tom, or any of the other adults who were now staring openly, but directly towards my son. Ethan, who had been staring at his shoes, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, usually clouded with a mixture of apprehension and resignation in these family settings, widened almost imperceptibly. "Ethan," the man said, his voice rich and resonant, carrying easily across the lawn. It wasn't loud, but it commanded attention. "There you are. I was hoping I might find you here." My son didn't speak, but a faint flush crept up his neck. The paper plate was still in his hand, forgotten. The man stopped a few feet from him. He didn't loom, didn't condescend. He simply stood, his posture open and inviting. "Your mother mentioned you'd be here. I was just passing through town and thought I'd see if you had a moment. I've been mulling over that chapter you sent me, the one about the migrating monarch butterflies. Your insights on their navigational patterns were quite remarkable." My jaw must have been slack. "Chapter? Migrating monarch butterflies?" I looked at Ethan, truly looked at him, and saw not just the boy who struggled with his SS sounds and his TT terrible cousins, but a flicker of someone else, someone I was only just beginning to understand. Ethan swallowed, his gaze darting to the man, then to me, then back to the man. He took a small, almost imperceptible breath. "And Mr. Caldwell," he said, the name emerging with a slight catch, but clear. Recognizable. "Mr. Caldwell. Arthur Caldwell." "The Arthur Caldwell?" The reclusive, award-winning nature writer whose books lined Ethan's shelves, whose documentaries Ethan watched with rapt attention, quoting facts about ecosystems and animal behavior for days afterwards. The man whose work was celebrated for its profound insight and lyrical prose? It couldn't be. Mr. Caldwell's smile deepened. Please, call me Arthur. We're collaborators now, aren't we? He gestured towards the half-eaten hot dog on Ethan's plate. Am I interrupting your lunch? Ethan shook his head mutely, his eyes, large and luminous, fixed on Mr. Caldwell. Good. Arthur Caldwell looked around, as if noticing the rest of us for the first time. He gave a polite, general nod. A family gathering, I see. Lovely. His gaze returned to Ethan. Perhaps we could find a quiet spot for a few minutes? I have a new field guide I wanted to show you. There's a section on alpine flora I think you'll find particularly interesting, especially after your observations on the microclimates in the Rockies. Alpine flora? Microclimates in the Rockies? My son, my quiet, introspective Ethan, who I thought spent his solitary hours lost in worlds of his own making, had been corresponding with Arthur Caldwell? Sharing observations? Collaborating. The silence on the lawn was absolute. Mark and David, who had been smirking only moments before, now stood with their mouths slightly agape, their earlier bravado vanished. Laura's hand was frozen midway to her glass of iced tea. My brother Mike was staring, a strange expression on his face, confusion, perhaps a dawning respect. Even Tom looked bewildered, his usual easygoing confidence momentarily shaken. It was the memory of a school play, years ago. Ethan had been cast as a tree. He had one line, "The forest is quiet." He'd practiced it for weeks, standing in front of that same bathroom mirror. The FF forest is choo-choo quiet. On the night of the play, when his cue came, he'd opened his mouth, and nothing had come out. Just a choked silence. The other children had giggled. A few parents had tittered. I'd felt a hot flush of shame, not for him, but for them, for their lack of grace. Ethan had stood there, rooted to the spot, his face burning, until the teacher gently prompted him. He'd finally managed a barely audible whisper. Afterwards, he hadn't spoken for the rest of the evening, retreating into a shell so dense I feared I'd never reach him. That memory, so sharp and painful, contrasted starkly with the scene unfolding before me. Ethan looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. A feeling I couldn't quite name, a fierce, soaring pride, mixed with a profound sense of awe, was unfurling within me. There's a B-bench, Ethan said, his voice still soft, still carrying the ghost of his stutter, but with a new, subtle thread of confidence. He pointed towards a weathered wooden bench under the shade of the largest oak tree, away from the main cluster of picnic tables. It's quiet over there. Perfect, Mr. Caldwell said, his eyes twinkling. He placed a light hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of easy camaraderie, and together, the acclaimed author and my quiet son walked towards the bench. They moved out of the direct line of sight of most of the family, but I could still see them. Mr. Caldwell pulled a slim, leather-bound book from his jacket pocket. He opened it, and soon, they were engrossed, heads bent together, Mr. Caldwell pointing at something on a page, Ethan nodding, occasionally offering a soft-spoken comment that made the older man listen with genuine attentiveness. The spell was broken. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, more subdued. The laughter, when it came, was gentler, less raucous. I saw Laura shoot a sharp, warning glance at Mark and David, who now seemed more interested in kicking at clumps of grass than in finding new ways to torment their cousin. My brother Mike walked over to me, a sheepish look on his face. "Sarah," he began, then paused, searching for words. Who is that man with Ethan?" "That," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "is Arthur Caldwell." Mike's eyebrows shot up. "The writer?" "The Arthur Caldwell." I simply nodded. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, looking over at the bench where Ethan and Mr. Caldwell were still deep in conversation. "Ethan knows Arthur Caldwell?" There was a note of incredulity in his voice, but also, unmistakably, a new respect. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Mr. Caldwell stayed for perhaps half an hour. Before he left, he sought out Tom and me, shaking our hands warmly. "You have a remarkable son," he said, his gaze direct and sincere. "His curiosity is boundless, and his intellect is truly impressive. He has a unique way of seeing the world. It's a privilege to exchange ideas with him." He didn't mention Ethan's speech. He didn't need to. His admiration was for Ethan's mind, his spirit. In that moment, the stutter, the thing that had defined Ethan in the eyes of so many, the thing that had caused him so much private pain and public humiliation, seemed to shrink, to become just one small facet of a much larger, more brilliant whole. As the black SUV pulled away, a different kind of silence fell over the gathering. It wasn't the stunned silence of surprise anymore, nor the awkward silence of discomfort. It was something else, something quieter, more thoughtful. The mocking had stopped entirely. When Ethan rejoined the group, tentatively at first, no one met his eyes with derision. Instead, there were curious glances, even a few hesitant smiles. David, the older of the cousins, mumbled something about needing more ketchup and hurried away from the picnic table as Ethan approached. Mark just looked down, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his paper napkin. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, Ethan and I found ourselves in the kitchen, packing away leftovers. The house was quieter now, most of Earth's family having departed. The rhythmic clink of plates and the crinkle of aluminum foil were the only sounds for a while. Ethan carefully placed a stack of plastic containers into a reusable bag. He was humming softly, a tuneless little melody I hadn't heard from him in a long time. He paused, then looked up at me, a small, shy smile playing on his lips. "Mr. C. Caldwell said, he said my chapter on the way bee butterflies use the sun to navigate was really good." His voice was still hesitant, the words still a journey, but there was a lightness in it, a brightness in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was very small, before the world had taught him to be wary of speaking. "I know it was, sweetie," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. This time, they were tears of relief, of a profound, quiet joy. "He's right. You have a unique way of seeing things." He ducked his head, but the smile remained. He picked up a leftover piece of cornbread, taking a small bite. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, the scent of grilled food and citronella still hanging faintly in the air. The grill was still smoking, a thin tendril of white rising into the twilight sky. But this time, the silence that surrounded us, the silence in our kitchen, wasn't heavy with unspoken anxieties or the residue of cruelty. It was a silence filled with peace, with understanding, with the quiet hum of a battle won not through confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable power of being truly seen. My son, my quiet, observant Ethan, had found his voice, not by conquering his stutter, but by sharing the remarkable world that existed within him, a world that a kind and discerning man had recognized and honored. And in that recognition, he had given us all a gift, the chance to see Ethan, and perhaps ourselves, a little more clearly.